Now I would like to call on the Prime Minister.
Just as a heads up, I'm going to keep my camera off because my Wi-Fi is being spotty.
No worries.
And for POIs, please use the chat. The state is an arbitrary political construct that very few people ever consent to, but every single second of its existence threatens our violence and our liberty. Our case in OG is very simple. The most important thing in this debate is the human will, and the existence of the state is always going to threaten our capacity to be free and to make choices. I'm going to start my speech with some framing and then get into two arguments. Firstly, why we can never meaningfully consent to the existence of a state or to the way that a state operates. And then secondly, how the state massively threatens our will in a way that is highly important. Getting into some framing. Firstly, what we think that the state is the government that is in a position of power, but more importantly, the entirety of that regime. So all institutions that are associated with the state. So concerns the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and very importantly, the military as well. In terms of framing about what morally illegitimate actually means, number one, we do not have to prove that the state is like the best kind of way, or like Ob cannot just say that the state is better than the state of nature in order to disprove immorality, right? Even if there is another thing that from a utilitarian perspective would be immoral, it doesn't negate the fact that the existence of the state as well could be something that is morally problematic. I think that secondly, it also doesn't matter if the state is like practically justified whatsoever or the best alternative that we have if we are able to prove that is immoral at the end of the day. So the first claim that I'm going to make is that the state is just a political structure that we can never meaningfully consent to. I want to analyze this in a couple ways. I think that firstly, historically speaking, in terms of the emergence of the state, it was just highly arbitrary that this happened to be our political system that came into existence. It happened to be a natural arc of history in terms of how resources were concentrated. I note that even if people within history consented to the existence of a state, number one, it was a massive collective action problem. So when states began to form, other states also needed to form in the sense that you needed to be able to compete with the increased power of the state to engage in resource extraction, but also preference can massively change over time between the generation that created states and between the kind of people that presently existed. I think that secondly, individual people who exist under a state have very little influence and power over shaping that the way that a state ultimately operates. I think that given that people do not have fixed preferences, how the state acts at a particular point of time, even if it has the democratic assent of the majority of people, is almost never reflective of the interests of everyone. It's often reflective of the interests of 51% of the population. In an autocracy, a far smaller percentage of that, and therefore many people are sidelined by what the state ultimately does. I think that secondly, there tends to be massive institutional inertia of the democratic preferences that are actually represented. Because given that most civil services are staffed by people who existed in the past, it is often disaligned between what people's current democratic preferences actually are. I think that thirdly, those who tend to control the state tend to be those who just arbitrarily have substantially more resources than everyone else within a particular society. So firstly, those who are privileged are better able to levy democratic processes by just campaign finance donations, massive political action committees, just the fact that they often vote in higher numbers because they are less disaffected by democratic structures, or like those who came to power just being from an ethnic group that happened to be colonially favored in systems that are less democratic. So what we have proved in this first claim is that there's never consent from the majority of people to how that state ultimately operates. Note that we're going to say that even if there is consent by the majority of people, the immense way that the state then still shapes the will of other people or shapes the will of people who voted for the state for a particular issue, but then violates their will in other issues is still something that is morally problematic. So then brings me into the second argument of how the state massively robs individuals of their will and their freedom. There are a few ways that this ultimately happens. The first thing to say is that every single action that we take within the structure of a state is belied by the implicit threat of violence. So if we fail to comply with a particular law, given that the state has a monopoly of force, that they often have massive militaries, there's always the threat that if we fail to comply with what the state wants, we're ultimately going to be killed, especially because of the massive asymmetry of power that exists between the state and between the individual. Note, even if there's not violence in the form of death, where the state will literally kill you, there is violence in the fact that police officers are literally allowed to storm into your home and to throw you in jail and to violate your freedom in that regard if you do not comply to a particular kind of law. Secondly, and relatedly, the state robs any capacity that we have to engage in a meaningful form of self-defense. I alluded to this, but an individual citizen is never going to be able to keep up between the power of the military or individually create any kind of change that is actually meaningful. Therefore, if you do not like a particular way that the state is behaving, you lack any kind of individualized power to to actually change the way that the state is operating. I think that thirdly, the state always constrains our freedom by forcing us to comply with very particular kinds of laws, right? So like if we are, for example, gay in particular countries, the state often bans us from being able to love who we want to because there are laws that massively constrain our actions. And even if you voted for some laws, you never consent to the myriad of ways that the state actively limits our freedom. Fourthly here, the state violates our choices to engage in forms of labor that is actually meaningful to us. Every single state basically needs to engage in taxation for a couple of reasons. Number one, it needs our money to be able to self-run its own industries and its own civil service. But secondly, it has to compete with other states because if your military ever gets too small, you're always going to be at a collective disadvantage. And therefore, you need to steal money from your own people in order to be able to run yourself. This violates choice because it instrumentalizes your own labor to a massive extent. You can never self-select into working if that is actually something that is meaningful for you, or keep the gains that you deserve because you chose to work and therefore you deserve those gains, but rather money is stolen from you, and it's stolen from the preference and from the choice that you actively made to work. Before I continue, I'll take CO.
So obviously this debate is not about the states right now, it's about the theory of states. So to a degree the state is representative and democratic and people can choose into it. Are you still thinking it's morally legitimate?
Absolutely still morally illegitimate. We don't think that everyone consents to that state, but it still violates the will of every people. And you often consent to one aspect of the state, but not the entirety of how those states are ultimately won. So given then that I've proven that the states violate our will in a myriad of ways, I want to give a couple weighing mechanisms about why then the will is the most important thing. I think that firstly, having our will and our capacity to make free choices is basically the only thing that makes us human at the end of the day. And the absence of our ability to actually have autonomy, we basically just fold into a feature of the natural universe where we're animalistic beings who are never actually able to act on our preferences. So insofar as our humanity is something that is important, that is inextricably linked to our ability to ultimately make choices. But secondly, our ability to make choices is a precursor for any kind of utility that is going to exist in our lives. States are not epistemic moral beings. They don't know what is actually meaningful to us. Therefore, the only way that we can actually get value in our lives is to self-select into our own utility, which necessitates having choices to actually be able to do that. So consent and choice is something that turns something like euthanasia, that's something that differentiates murder and euthanasia. But note that we think that unlike our preferences, which are very arbitrary and capricious, the human will is the only thing that is good within and of itself because it's a precondition for allowing us to choose things that are actually meaningful within our own lives. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to stand in opening government.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. And now I call on the leader for the opposition.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
There's a lot of background noise because Ajan is going on.
It is audible. Yeah, like it's fine.
Sure. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, since the past thousands of years, humans have defaulted into collectivization in whatever shape or form. Opening government cannot simply come up and tell us that this debate will not be relative, because the human nature to collectivize and take benefits from one another is something that has existed throughout history. We tell you that state is the best form of collectivization and is the most morally legitimate form of collectivization. We will deny the premise that this is not linked to utility in any way and is an absolute principle. Why? Because what OG argues is that it's about maximizing people's ability to exercise their free will, which in and of itself means that if you maximize your free will, people will be able to do whatever they want, or at least maximize what they can do. Therefore, this in and of itself is a utility. So the actor that can provide this best to you is the most morally legitimate actor in this particular case. And you cannot simply claim that states have failed in certain instances and therefore they're an illegitimate actor. We first obviously tell you that a lot of the examples are situational and there are better states and there are worse states. And this debate is not about arguing for bad states, so there's police brutality and forces you out, but it's a principle of what those things do. We first tell you in terms of engagement to opening government, that the kind of thing that tells you is that police can incite violence and therefore make you feel unsafe. We tell you the exact opposite. Because in a world where institutionalized security did not exist, you'd feel significantly more unsafe. You could not go out on the streets on your own because you know that you have the full responsibility of defending yourself. That kind of institutionalized defense is important. Taxes are great. I mean, yeah, not so much, but they're great because it allows a lot of people to exercise their rights by making sure that the poor who don't have access to resources do get those resources. They tell you that it makes you, it forces choices upon you. We argue that states are the reasons why people can maximize their choices more than they could in the alternative model that the OG points to in the very last minute. Why? States enable choice in a lot of ways. They provide education. That means somebody who did not previously have a social mobility can now have that mobility. It allows you to access jobs. It gives you healthcare, meaning that you don't have to worry too much about falling sick and live too cautiously. It allows people to propel businesses. That means you can actualize your dreams by means of economic emancipation. It allows you to move outside of your country if you're a legitimate state. That means you can break out of that lottery of birth. The comparative is that while every single individual is born into in a circumstance that they did not choose, the state is the best way in which you can get out of that choice. And therefore, it is the best actor that enables you to make that move, right? And therefore, it is morally legitimate in terms of you being able to access free will. Then they tell us that it's arbitrary. Yes, so is any form of collectivization, right? Because it's based on which geographical location you happen to be born in, because alternatives would be worse, as I'll tell you later. But we also believe that when you say that people have little power, we don't agree with that. Why? Because a lot of the things that happen in a country, policies, laws, etc., are currently being shaped or influenced heavily by these individuals. As a comparative, states have more reason to listen to people, for example, right before elections. And there are times when the state is powerful as well. This power is something that is like a seesaw. It goes between people and comes back. The question is whether in exchange for this power, people are getting something in return. And we tell you that they get a lot of rights in return, in which case this becomes a legitimate trade-off for people to make. And the fact that the state is powerful is not a principle frame that's strong enough to tell you that they're morally illegitimate, right? What do we bring from the opening opposition? We've already established that societies have a natural tendency to develop a collectivized structure. We first tell you that anarchy is worse because having to defend yourself, having to fend for yourself, and having no formal structure in which to live your life is quite terrible, right? Because in that situation, your ability to access your freedoms and rights is the worst possible scenario. So we think that collectivization is important because it allows you to develop collective action. It allows you to take the best of different individuals so they can contribute in a way in which it creates synergy. It creates a common sense of belief and allows establishment of structures to which you can build infrastructures, to which you can build security systems, to which you can build culture, to which you can build a sense of justice, etc. that allows a nation to operate and form. It allows resource sharing, where people have a common interest to share resources with one another, because the alternative is one where you forcefully take resources away and expect no repercussions as a result of that, which, for example, happens in tribal structures in alternative societies. And we think there's a consequence of power sharing and grabbing. Therefore, that's the society in which you can best thrive. We then tell you that given that there is a natural tendency to collectivize, alternative forms of collectivization that would not be a state would potentially be one where you collectivize on the basis of things such as religion, ethnicity, race, etc. Why is that bad or much, much more illegitimate? First of all, because that's far more arbitrary, right? Because in a state, you have the choice to opt into a state based on the collective beliefs and principles or the economic policies that that particular state has. Even if you can't opt in, you can decide what kind of policies will be implemented through the means of an election. But in comparison, if the entire agenda is based on race, religion, ethnicity, that's significantly worse. Before I move on, POI from closing government.
Even if the annex...
Guys.
This debate is not a call for the comparative of the anarchy. Absent this, your burden is not to prove that our side is worse, but why states are morally legitimate.
Right. So we've already done that by telling you how the state offers people rights in comparison to a non-collectivist society. But the reason why this always will be a comparative is that the moral legitimacy is linked to where people can maximize their rights and maximize their happiness, maximize their utility. And therefore, this debate cannot exist in absence of that in pure absolute terms, but I'll get to that as well. We think that at the end of the day, alternative forms of collectivization are worse because you can sway people with doctrine and history that you cannot have control over on immutable features and incentive structures that are not that cannot be held accountable features than policies, for example, how religious you are, and the narratives you can create in societies are things that you cannot sway away from, and it's significantly harder to opt out of these systems. Apart from these 5 reasons, we also think that states have a natural incentive to encompass more people because that can make the state more powerful if you can get that resource and cooperation from others. It also means that in order for that state to prosper, that cooperation will lead to more people being able to opt out and opt in, and when they do opt in, they'll get a lot more from that state, allowing you to maximize utility, maximize their rights in that particular state. So this is especially true for minorities who currently would not be able to collectivize in a meaningful way that doesn't force you out. In the end, we tell you the reason why a state is morally legitimate, even on top of the relative term, is that it's a situation where you get to balance the power you give up and the rights that are given back to you. And in a situation where this is comparatively better than its alternatives, this is the most morally legitimate actor that can exist. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. And now I call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Great. And sorry, I'm just going to keep my camera off as well, just because Wi-Fi where I'm from is not very good. Side opposition's case is premised on a default to collectivization, that the most legitimate means legitimate. This is not the case. A murderer can tell me that there are 3 options for him to do: murder 2 people, murder 1 person, or murder 3 people. I would probably be right to say that he should only murder that 1 person, but that does not make that morally justified in the instance that he had another option, which was less problematic, but also it does not make it morally justified in and of itself, regardless of whether or not there are other options. Just because one option might also be bad does not validate you taking a heinous course of action, does not make it morally justified. Just because something is on the comparative more morally justified doesn't mean opposition can only defend the state against total anarchism. And I'm going to do 2 things in my speech. First, explain that. Secondly, actually engage with a comparative anarchism, explain why it's actually not that bad, coercion is the most important, and explain why that's important. Then finally, explain why the state is by definition exclusionary and necessarily exploits everyone who is not in the state, who absolutely cannot consent. I want to first engage with this idea of representative democracy coming out from opposition. This is both a POI from CO and also a point from OO. The issue with representative democracy is twofold. Firstly, it fundamentally only validates the votes of, at best, 51% of the population. In most instances of true representative democracies, it's more like 38% when you do a plurality of votes rather than a majority. It seems to me that it's completely unfair if their metric is only supporting the needs of like 62% of the population at most, maybe 50% at least, right? So it seems to me that that's probably not, if they want to run that, a reasonable defense of the argument of coercion that we were given. But then also, it's just unclear that people can have access to representative democracies. They say that they only need to defend the abstract concept of the state, but in every instance, the state seeks to be mutually exclusionary to maintain its power. This is a natural human tendency to be greedy, and that's what lawmakers naturally tend to do. For example, it means Canadian politicians taking money from the coal industry, even though that's exclusive and damaging to the rest of Canada as a whole. It means American politicians taking money from the NRA because they want to maintain their ideological hegemony and hold on power. That is a natural human tendency that arises in every state. It is essentially a feature of that state. And so it seems to me that that's not very representative. And so that leads to terrible policies, for example, like gerrymandering, where politicians want to maintain their hegemony on power. It leads to terrible policies like voter ID laws in the United States that means African Americans can't vote. The state in and of itself necessarily leads to the exclusion of those groups who violate the will of politicians who necessarily have to be the proxy of the state. So it seems to me that that representative democracy didn't end up being representative after all. So we thought that then by postulate, consent was violated for several reasons, because you never had consent in the past. They say you have a default to collectivization. That's absolutely not true. Humans started off as like communes, not as states, but then when one single civilization started to be a state and started to be colonial and started murdering everyone else, they had to become states to have militaries to defend themselves. But consent couldn't happen right now. They say you can consent when you can change policy. One, you absolutely could not change policy. But even if you could, you can't change the fundamental precepts of the state that are outlined in, for example, constitutions. It meant that things like laws were necessarily lorded over your head, that you could not opt out of the police brutalizing you, taking you into the jail, and putting you into prison for the rest of your life for a crime that you did not, for example, consent to. It meant that that could not happen, that all of your productive capacity was necessarily ripped away from you by taxation. This is important. Opposition might say that you can have obligations that are not consensual, but this is at best a well-articulated lie. Things like family obligations are not legitimate in and of themselves. They are semi-voluntary. We reaffirm them every day by opting into that situation. But you don't have any way of opting out of a state in the same way adoption services, for example, allow you to opt out of a family. And so even if you can move, for example, immigrate, you are still locked into a coercive state, just maybe not the same coercive state. And so this implies to us that there is absolutely no way of getting away from that consent. So why was consent so important? They say that the will was not of independent value, that, for example, practical outcomes matter because in the instance that you are coerced, for example, by situation, then you're unable to change your practical outcomes, your will is still cranked down upon. Firstly, there's a difference between active and passive harm. It is worse to kill someone than passively let someone die. And so in the same way, by proxy, it is worse for the state to actively instrumentalize someone, to rip away their productive capacity, to enslave them by taking tax from them, than it is to passively let them suffer, for example. But secondly, there is a prerequisite to fulfilling all other human values, being able to decide for yourself what is the good life, being able to go to work and know that you aren't being instrumentalized, having your money ripped away from you by an unjustified state. So even if the alternative was anarchy, where you had very little service, that alternative is still better because it means that you aren't actively having your will constrained by a state that is illegitimate. But finally, coercion was independently wrong. For example, I could, let's say my grandmother has a life-threatening illness that she is going to die from in 2 months. I should still tell her of that illness, even if it made her life materially poorer, because coercion is in and of itself an active moral harm. And when the state does this upon civilians, by taking away their money, by putting them in prison, by making them go fight in wars for the state, that is fundamentally coercive and fundamentally illegitimate. Regardless of whether anarchism is the alternative, the state in and of itself is legitimate. But finally, we just think anarchism isn't that bad. For example, collectives like the Spanish Commune was literally only stopped because the state had to reinforce its power and literally slaughter thousands of civilians. In that instance, we suggest that you can have, for example, collective morality independent of whether or not the state exists. Sure, there might be some more murders, but I'm unclear if that's practically legitimate or illegitimate compared to the state actively taking away all of your money and your productive capacity through taxation and forcing you to fight wars for the state. We just think that's probably on comparative a little bit worse. Sia, go for it.
Is your comparative then communes, which are dictated by the hierarchy of the family or whoever is stronger?
The point is, our comparative doesn't have to be anything. Something can be illegitimate in and of itself. A murderer is both illegitimate to kill 2 people and 1 person, even if killing 1 person is slightly better. So I don't need a comparative. But 2, probably communes are slightly better, even if it's controlled by slightly more by one family than it is in a state where it's controlled by literally one political class that's controlled by coal companies, etc. But finally, the state is by definition exclusionary. It necessarily has to define itself, or else it can't be a global state because there are other groups that want to be exclusive themselves, for example, like ethnicity, ethnic states, etc. So what necessarily has to happen is the state has to create its own borders, and it has to police those borders. It means it often kicks out refugees or doesn't allow them to enter. It means that it often goes to other wars against other states because it cares more for itself than it cares for the individuals in those other states. That was important because regardless of whether or not people within the coercive state itself can consent, which they obviously can't, people outside of that state in other regions cannot. So it meant that when the United States went to war in Iran or in Iraq, basically to want oil for itself, that was unjust instrumentalization of the people far away and necessarily came about as a direct result of the state wanting to accrue more money for itself and its population. The state is fundamentally coercive. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and I call on the deputy leader for the opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Cool. starting my speech. 3, 2, 1. Three things in the speech. First, I'll explain to you the exact framing in which the opening government applies is trying to argue their case here today. That the point at which there is some degree of scale in which a particular brand of the state is not fulfilled, it becomes illegitimate. I'll explain to you why this is an incorrect frame and why, to the extent that it does apply, the state is legitimate. Second, I'll explain to you why the state is the only way to prevent individuals from the grossest of illegitimate outcomes, and therefore is by far the protection against the most immoral conditions that individuals are born into. But last, I'll explain to you why the state is in fact the best individual to be in control of the monopoly of violence, because the explanation from opening government is that yes, they have power, but it wasn't to suggest that this is by definition therefore illegitimate. All right, firstly, I think that the way in which they try to show what we've explained today is that the state is the best among a few bad actors. But if you look at their own analysis, the vast majority of their content looks like the state doesn't fully represent all individuals. The state often doesn't change sufficiently in the interests of all people. What this explains on the flip is that the state actively represents 51% of people in general. The state actively changes itself to deal with the interests of certain groups of people at all times progressively. So the framing can either be that they are completely failing to meet all individuals' needs, therefore they're illegitimate, or it can be in an arbitrary world, they represent the interests of a lot of people already and they always try to do more, which means they are legitimate. The question is how legitimate they are. In this instance then, the opening government cannot argue that because they fail a certain scale of what the objective of representation is, they are blanketly illegitimate. Therefore, they themselves have introduced this debate into a scale, and therefore if that scale is reasonably tilted towards the side of some degree of representation, they cannot arbitrarily say power structures mean you can never have change. Why is the state then prone to change? Firstly, the state is often held to account in many ways. Number one, often it is the case that the state is empowered by individuals on the ground because you gain power by gaining resources from those very people. You need stability and your control of the country because individuals in the country are not protesting and therefore deterring your state structures which keep you in power. Which means it is often the case that by definition, the state is empowered by the people, which is why when states form and they are most vulnerable, they try to establish certain structures like a Supreme Court which helps individuals irrespective of governments in power, like free media which allows individuals to protest irrespective of governments in power. Often the formation of states in larger scale means that there are often interstate interactions, which often create a sense of external accountability. These are reasons why the state, by definition of its formation, allows some ground-up control over what kind of things occur. But second of all, the state's power is often not permanent because it is cyclical and depends on election results. Often then, individuals have the ability to control their populations and therefore gain popularity and actually come into power, which is why grassroots politicians and other things are largely on the rise, allowing them to challenge pre-existing state structures. But lastly, the state is uniquely an actor, which is a formation of an amalgam of different people, all of whom control some resource, all of whom have the capacity to help the state itself develop and consolidate its own power, which means if you're a minority in like institutions hold certain resources or simply labor resources that you can improve for your own benefit. The state is always faced with a trade-off where they can incorporate them for the overall good or essentially create conflict and destabilize themselves, which means inherently there is a a redistributive nature within states. The reason why all of this is important is the state is often held to account, even when it is not, it has an incentive to ensure it does not actively harm individuals. The question then lastly that remains from the opening government case of illegitimacy is that the state is often formed based on old values. This is a timeline problem. Those old people die, the state has new people. But I think it's just likely that states progressively change because there's often the development of resources, technology, information, and education, all of which change the value systems of people, which is why we've seen constitutions being amended by dint of individual protests and certain cases being brought into the legal system, which then proves that it is often the case that number one, the state can be held to account, but number two, that the state is often controlled based on social interests. The point of all of this response is to suggest that if you talk about the scale of morality representation, we've explained to a large extent with the vast majority of cases, it is in fact legitimate. But let's look at the other frame, and we're going to give them the best benefit of the doubt. They only have to prove that the state is legitimate. Two reasons why it is the most legitimate actor. In absence of states, people are born arbitrarily into a world without consent. In that instance, they are left to arbitrary circumstances. What does this look like? It is often them being left in nature, where they are the most prone to the worst kinds of violence on themselves. These are things like disease, these are things like natural calamities, and these are things like other people who in a non-state world have accumulated power as well. Everyone is subject to these forms of violence in a world where they never consented to being born. But the problem is there is no central power structure to regulate the extent of authority that each of those power structures can essentially apply to an individual victim that is a person in that world. We think that the state is the only kind of structure which, irrespective of the quality of the state, ensures that the overall system protects them against the worst forms of natural calamities and natural disasters, which means that it is the only way in which these people who are the most vulnerable have some form of self-defense. Therefore, the minimum bar for morality of allowing individuals the right to self-defense in a world in which they're otherwise completely vulnerable is the state. And therefore, you cannot claim legitimacy without the existence of the state. Therefore, the most legitimate form of collectivization. But secondly, it is often the form of collectivization which maximizes the number of choices that individuals have. Something that Elo already talks about. The number of rights or freedom that you can access often relies on the number of utilitarian choices you're able to exercise, and that in turn maximizes happiness of individuals. Does closing government have a point? Okay, Oji, quick.
So the Turkish state is built off of the exploitation of the Kurds who can never meaningfully have influence. In fact, it's politically popular to crack down on the Kurds because that generates a benefit. So the state always instrumentalizes and coerces some portion of the population for collective benefit.
Sorry, yeah, correct. There are also some really great states which have allowed a lot of individuals to access power. Naturally, the trade-off is that even in those instances, you're protected from the worst kinds of violence and still have some form of self-defense, which is what you don't have on your side. In any case, maximization of choices. This is through utilitarianism. The state allows for this in three ways. Number one, it allows for resource pooling and collective action, where individuals otherwise would have had access to their own land or a part of water that they have, but they could not collectivize those from agriculture. They have their own resource, but other kinds of natural resources, they cannot collectivize those from industries. Therefore, states allow seamless communication to create supply chains that actually create utilitarian change. Secondly, equal treatment often means that the individuals tend to prioritize the state over themselves, which is why there's often taxation that people accept. Therefore, there's a kind of redistributive power existing here in absence of the simple graciousness of individuals, which is the only thing you rely on in any world without the state. But lastly, the scale of states often means that the scale structure is one which allows for overall cooperation. The comparison then becomes all forms of development are contingent upon the formation of the state. Otherwise, once again, you are completely at the mercy of nature, which is the worst form of violence. The question that lastly remains then is that the state often exercises violence that is subjective to the accountability point, but in absence, you're always subject to worse forms of violence. For all those reasons, then go with opening up.
Thank you very much for that speech. And I would like to call on the member for government.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Is it too late to revoke consent for stream? All right, thank you. Thank you. Anyway.
for that speech, and I would like to call on the member for the opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Before I start my speech, I would like to affirm that I do consent. So there's a permanent record of whatever I say here. Okay, POIs in the chat, please. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate is won upon proving that the state is legitimate, which is really just code for proving the state aligns with some moral framework, whether it be utilitarian or deontological. The first observation I want to make is it is not sufficient to say that the state is in some instances morally problematic, which is distinct from saying it is legitimate insofar as the majority of circumstances where the state exists still aligns with the actual, instantiation of that principle. But moreover, the second and most important observation is you need to prove why this metric you're using to frame this debate is the most important one. OO's failure is to simply argue that there are some benefits to states, but not actually challenge the principle coming out from opening government, which is the existence of freedom and agency. We will deal with their murder intuition, and we will deal with freedom. 3 things in this speech. First, why freedom is a farce, or at the very least not likely to be a meaningful metric in this debate, and also why we get freedom better on our side. 2, all the other metrics and why we get these things. And 3, future. Firstly, I want to deal with the murder intuition. So they say murder is bad, and it would be bad if you were forced to murder 1 person as opposed to murdering 3 people. This analogy is problematic because the base situation that they assume is that people will be alive. But the base situation in status quo is not that. Because if the murderer was necessary for the other people that you were forced to murder to actually have a chance of existing in the first place, to have a chance of reaching their dreams, is the case, then perhaps it might actually be legitimate to be forced to murder this 1 person. Because for a variety of reasons, the first is that the state might exist as a means of self-defense, and as a result, it might be valid to curtail the rights of someone else. It might be valid for you to seek justice against another individual. It might be valid for you to even just desire utility and be forced to sacrifice someone if you're going to sacrifice anyone, at least sacrifice someone in a way that gives you utility. The parallel for this note is that if a person donates $1 million, even if they could donate $1 billion, it's still justified because it reduces suffering on net. Anyway, let's debunk the freedom metric. Note that this argument is important because if it's true, then not only do we have the gateway to all of opening opposition's benefits, but notably, we prove the most salient thing in the round by, overturning the debate on its head. So, the first thing is some responses to the preemptive material OG brought out. First, they say our will is the only thing that makes us human. This is an arbitrary definition of humanity. Like the ability to do a lot of other things, like have a state, collectivization, and freedom, and like even iPhones make us different from animals. This is one of the things that make us human, but it's not necessarily true that it's the only thing that makes us human. Presumably, a state is also one of the things that make us human. But secondly, it's unclear why being different from animals is even different. We have lots of other similarities with animals, like eating, breathing, and like fucking. Secondly, they say, well, OG, having a will is a prerequisite to have things that we care about. The first thing I want to point out is if they don't prove that will even exists in the first place, with or absent the state, then they get no net change literally. So nothing changes on their side. But more importantly, we also explain that the life is a precondition to will. So the fact that some people would have been killed absent the state, the fact that some people would not exist at all, or that some people would not have access to the things that they need to exercise their will, means that even if will is important to some degree, life is more important and is a prerequisite to that will. Anyway, 6 reasons why will and freedom is unlikely to exist meaningfully in this debate. 1, determinism. Your body is governed by a set of laws, a series of inputs and outputs that may be complex but are still ultimately out of your control. Note that even if there is quantum uncertainty, which just means that you're governed by randomness, not the will, so it doesn't prove that they win. It also unclear whether or not this bridges the gap between quantum and classical mechanics. Secondly, biology, our psychological biases that govern us. We have no control over the food we like, our taste, our aspirations. Insofar as we cannot force ourselves to like something, we are governed by what we are born into. Thirdly, social conditioning for all the reasons that Gov mentions. Fourthly, we also exercise freedom in ways that reduce our own future freedom. We might make bad decisions for ourselves, decisions that we might regret, like selling ourselves into slavery, like smoking, which might cause lung cancer. But notably, people also have dreams, and insofar as they don't have a practical mechanism to achieve and actualize these dreams, they are still not free insofar as they can't achieve these things. The difference is that our side gives you the capacity to actualize and instantiate that will into something meaningful. But fifthly, note that you also limit the future freedom of others when you do certain things, like the social norms you impose on others, the resources that you consume, the time gap and the power that you exercise when in your largesse when you are in old age and other people that you are young that you are oppressing. But sixthly, the existence of the state notably is also a prerequisite to the confinement and access of that will. So OGOO runs education, but they really don't run why this is important. The reason why education is important is for you to actually feel like you have a will, for you to reflect, for you to aspire, and to think about things. If you didn't have education to know what will was in the first place, will wouldn't even be an important thing in this debate. All these points mean that one, now here are the three meta weighings as for why the 6 points of analysis I gave you were important. Firstly, insofar as Gov's reasons for the state's illegitimacy is the violation of some will, it is unclear if you would even have free will in the first place, which means that it's unclear whether or not the state makes things any more illegitimate. Secondly, the existence of the state gets rid of other sources of illegitimacy and reduces other sources of the reduction of will, which means that on net, it's a reduction of obstructions to that will. But thirdly, and most importantly, the state of human existence naturally restricts human freedom, and the regulations, laws, and abilities that the state imposes on people protects future freedoms, particularly those in the future. Particularly if you were born into an abusive family, the state has laws against that kind of thing, whereas on their side, they would have nothing. Note, this also obliterates closing government's extension on hypothetical murder for three reasons. One, it's unclear if this hypothetical life is a meaningful life. They are not alive, they don't breathe, they don't feel pain. It's unclear why this murder is a bad thing. Two, our side reduces the amount of possibility murder because we give you more possibilities, the ability to aspire for more, to collectivize for more, and thus have more opportunity, which means that you can actually have more possibilities before you, even if some are paired away. But three, know that any actions you do as an individual can reduce future freedoms of other individuals or future freedoms of people in the future. So our side imposes restrictions by allowing you to not murder someone else, by allowing you to not groom someone else, by allowing you to not do terrible things to another individual, which note is exactly why we preserve more freedom on net. Remember, they don't explain why some restriction of freedom is a bad thing, especially when most legal frameworks and even most moral frameworks all around the world concede that it's important for you to restrict some freedoms in the pursuit of self-defense, in the pursuit of justice, and in the pursuit of utility. For these reasons, we've already won this debate. Before that, I'll take a POI from OG.
So biology and socialization might constrain our choices somewhat, but it doesn't mean that we have no choices. Most of us would agree that killing a healthy person to get their organs to save 5 sick people is morally wrong. It doesn't justify instrumentalizing people, even if you get utilitarian outcomes.
That's an assertion. You don't explain why that's the case. But moreover, we gave you other ways that your will is constrained. Moreover, even if you would have some unfettered will, they don't explain why this unfettered will is good. It is our side that makes people relate to that will, connect to that will, have that will be chained to your identity. The fact that you have a state education at all means that you know your will is important, as opposed to a world where you did not know this will was important in the first place. But more importantly, we have a few other points. The first is that there's no moral distinction between being savage by a lion and being savage at the hands of a police officer, but the outcome is the same. But the difference is that our side has a recourse to nature that is more than just violence. It is the capacity to sue this person. It is the capacity to vote this person out, which doesn't require you to do something violent and egregious yourself. But more importantly, we also think that states protect people in the future. They assume that people are always better at approximating their interests. Aside from the fact that there are individual biases and a lack of information, which make it impossible, the state not only corrects these things for all the reasons we've given earlier, we also prove that unfettered freedom is also legitimate insofar as any freedom is a trade between you and the freedoms of other peoples. It is the state that balances these freedoms, both for the billions of people in the future that they protect from you and other people in the state in which you exist. So at the end of this speech, we do two very, very basic things to win. First is we prove that what actual legitimacy is, and second, and what makes it distinct from just something being morally problematic. But two, we explain why their side does not get the principle they deserve, and it's for these reasons we must negate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd like to call on the government whip.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So Gov argues the states restrict freedom. OO argues the states increase utility. That's the obvious part of the debate. Where the debate actually exists is trading off the freedom and the utility and explaining why either side is better and more salient. And that's the problem with the opening half and to an extent closing government too, because they prove the things that are easy to prove. Obviously, states have increased utility. It's clear and empirical, and Gov doesn't really challenge that. The question then that opening opposition missed is why that utility outweighs beyond an intuition assertion that self-defense is more important than the marginal changes of freedom we got coming from a POI. So how do you win this debate then? We proved to you the weighing metric, and that's why you ought to take it. But before that, I just want to take out the non-inherent features of states that Gov claims to be harms and are not relevant. So CG tries to bring this argument about Kantian theory, why states make false promises. This is an argument for politicians not making promises or making false promises or saying things like it is possible for change to happen, but not guaranteeing it. It's not an argument for inherent nature of states, because not all states have politicians making false promises. But secondly, even if it's the case, I'm not sure why Kant is correct. Like, just asserting that Kant said this or no, some person said this does not prove it's a morally legitimate theory. Presumably lying at some instances is a good thing, especially if it protects the lives of individuals. You don't really claim whether that's true. The second thing coming from OG is that it's harmful because states invade other states or harm people who are not in the state. That is an argument against invading other states, not an argument for the state existing. In fact, if you generally believe in the sovereignty of states, then presumably you wouldn't be invading other people. Again, not inherent and therefore not part of the debate. Let's go to the debate then. The first thing he pointed out is that free will is not the most important metric in the round because that's not challenged by closing government. Freedom does not exist. We told you that the condition for believing in free will is an important metric for morality is that you believe it exists in the first place. Because if it does not, then on either side, you're not harming free will because there's no existence in the very first place. We explained to you that everything that exists in the material reality right now either follows the laws of existence or rules, or if you believe more advanced theory, follows some degree of randomness in how our atoms move. At no point does Gov prove to us why we are able to make a decision-making or part of our body or part of your humanity is detached from that physical reality. So it's unclear whether or not you believe that the people actually have free will, that it's not attached or chained by the external circumstances of your actions. This is important because even if the state chains you or someone else chains you or your biology chains you, on both sides of the house you'll still change. There's no net change to freedom. Notably, you don't have to believe our case that free will does not exist, but to a degree they don't prove that free will exists. You have to weigh their case with the uncertainty that maybe free will doesn't matter with respect to morality versus the relative certainty that people generally care about, like basic needs of services, generally care about the protection of lives of individuals, making people live longer periods of time. So we proved to you that this is the mechanism necessary to prove why OO's mechanisms of why they get better lives are significantly more important. The response coming from Julia was to concede the point really, and then just say, well, this doesn't prove that states are legitimate. It removes the only mechanism that Gov has that's a standing about why states are illegitimate. That is, it restricts freedom. So assuming we're able to disprove that, then the debate should be judged on the utilitarian metrics. And therefore, if they don't have a claim against utilitarian metrics, we take the debate over them already. We also responded to the metrics of the framing preemptions coming from PM that OO does not respond to. We told you that our ability to differentiate ourselves from animals does not prove a morally good thing because iPhones differentiate ourselves from animals, but breathing will make us the same as animals doesn't prove morality. And secondly, the ability for you to will utility to be important is contingent on your ability to believe that free will exists in the first place. If it is not, then it's just a bunch of factors in our regard. But secondly, even if you don't buy that, we engage them at their best case. We explain to you why even if you believe this metric is only about freedom, we are better able at being able to do so. I want to survey Gov's claims. So OG says there's a problem with representative democracy. It's not perfect. OG says there's threats to violence that means you're be forced to follow the laws. And Gov says in a more sophisticated fashion that the state indoctrinates you and therefore you don't have any particular free will. I want to point out that this is to some degree probably true, right? But the burden that they have to prove here is that the state completely takes away your free will. Because presumably in the status quo with the states, you still have some degree of freedom. You still have a stand to be free. Not everyone believes state indoctrination. And a lot of times indoctrination by the state is condemned. A lot of states are libertarian-ish, which allows people to do being free in a lot of respects of their life. Not total freedom, but to some degree, they're able to be free under their side of the house. Why is it important? You have to weigh then that trade-off realistically of freedom with the mechanisms you provide us why we're more likely to increase freedom under our side of the house. The first thing he pointed out is that for you to appreciate freedom in the first place, which is the necessary condition for you to want to care about the freedom under your side, you need the development of utility and the development of society. Coming from there, we talked about, and there's no response, the development of things like education, where people are then able to rationalize themselves, critical thinking, and therefore be able to appreciate freedom in the first place. So even if technically people are more free, the ability to appreciate that freedom on the their side is significantly smaller. But secondly, I just want to point out that while your ability to be free is contingent on not being restricted, there are other prerequisites to freedom. One of them, for instance, is you being alive. You have to be able to breathe and act in the world for you to be able to act in any meaningful way to be free. In a world where the life expectancies are likely to go down, if you note how life expectancies as states develop increase a lot under our side of the house, that means people are free to some degree, but it is cut off or traded off by the fact that they don't live for long periods of time. But secondly, we would suggest that to a degree people are able to be free. It's contingent on your ability to act on that freedom. And this is a POI I asked coming from Tukinten, and also David brought up. We explained to you that for you to be able to, for example, if you have dreams about going to the moon, dreams about like being able to travel to different countries, dreams about being able to eat good food, these desires will exist on either side, but you need the state, the collective technology of the state, to be able to develop that and therefore get the change. Before I move on, OG, not CG.
Sorry, CD or OG, sorry.
OG.
There is a difference between the state actively ripping away money from individuals and instrumentalizing them, and society failing to give them benefit. You fail to engage with the act-omission distinction.
Yeah, that was a pure assertion from your speech, and I was about to engage with it now. There's no reason as to why that's a moral difference, right? Secondly, to a degree, you believe that a state of anarchy where the states would not exist would mean that people are likely to harm each other. Presumably, if you believe that people are still moral agents under that world, presumably the harm will still exist and therefore the coercion will still likely be symmetric. Unclear what is problematic. The last thing I want to point out then is we also beat the debate of whether or not, if it's a best alternative, it makes it morally justified. So OO says this is better than other alternatives, but they don't break the deadlock coming from opening government when they said that you being better than the worst alternatives doesn't work. We proved to you that that assumption only works if the base morality is static, which is people are alive on either side of the house, and you're choosing between creating one active harm or an active greater harm. But if the base society is already oppressive or restrictive, the reverse. We're reducing some degree of restrictions. We're improving the amount of freedom we're able to get under our side of the house. So at the end of this debate, if you believe that freedom is not important, we win. If you believe that freedom is important, the marginal change does not justify the massive changes in utility that states provides. And that's why it's still significantly morally legitimate under our side of the house. For those reasons, I think we clearly win. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that.